The purpose of this video is to show that two countries can become wealthier with trade. And we're going to show this using our model of U.S. and Cuba and production possibilities frontiers. There have been several videos up to now trying to help viewers understand exactly what these PPFs are and how they should be interpreted. The videos also showed how the U.S. has a comparative advantage in beer production, which means it can produce beer at a lower opportunity cost than Cuba, and Cuba has a comparative advantage in sugar, which means it can produce sugar at a lower cost. What we're going to do in this video is actually give an example where the U.S. and Cuba start off not trading, and as I show right here, we're going to assume that both countries, before they trade, produce and consume at point A. For U.S., that's right here, where they have 5 beer and 5 sugar. They're both producing and consuming 5 beer and 5 sugar. Whereas Cuba is at 4 sugar and 3 beer. And what we'll do now is we'll show that when these two countries engage in trade and they both produce the good and only the good that they have a comparative advantage in, and then gain in trade, both countries are going to be able to increase their consumption of both beer and sugar, thus becoming wealthier. So now, U.S. and Cuba are going to trade. And when two parties trade, each party will want to do what they're best at. And we've already shown that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in beer production, so it's only going to produce beer. And so it's going to be at this point right here where they produce 10 beer and no sugar. And notice that I'm using the notation here for the rectangle being the amount that the country produces. Cuba produces only sugar, so it's going to be able to produce 10 sugar. Now, of course, U.S. is not producing any sugar, but they want sugar, so they have to import it from Cuba. Likewise, Cuba is not producing any beer, but they want to drink beer, so they're going to import it from the U.S. There are a lot of different trades that the U.S. and Cuba can make that will make both countries better off. I'm just going to give you an example of one of those. Suppose that the U.S. trades 4 of its beers with Cuba for 5.5 sugar, which means that the U.S. is going to export 4 beer and it's going to import 5.5 sugar, and Cuba is going to export 5.5 sugar and it's going to import 4 beer. Now notice here, the amount of each good that a country produces and the amount that it consumes are two different things. We've already drawn where the countries are before trade, that's point B. We've also already drawn after trade how much each country is producing. I'm labeling that B now. The B rectangles are where they produce after trade. Now I'm going to draw their consumption. Let's take the U.S. They produce 10 beer. They're going to export 4 beer. That leaves them with 6 beer. So we know that the U.S. now has 6 beers. And they're going to be importing 5.5 sugar, which means the U.S. is now consuming right here. I'm going to label, that's my new circle, I'm going to call it point B. B is after trade. And as we can see, the U.S. moves from point A to point B. They gain 0.5 sugar and they gain 1 beer. So the U.S. gets more beer and sugar. They're wealthier. Now let's consider Cuba. Cuba produces 10 sugar. It exports 5.5 sugar. So it's going to have left for consumption 4.5 sugar. And then it's going to import for beer. So Cuba consumption after trade is at that circle point B, where they have 4.5 sugar and 4 beer. And just like the U.S., Cuba was able to gain more beer and more sugar merely by trading with another country. By engaging in trade, both the U.S. and Cuba are able to get 1 more beer than they could before and 0.5 more sugar than they could before. Now this whole thing, this model is a thought experiment. It's a model. And this model assumes that beer and sugar are the only things that the country produces, so they get more of everything. They're wealthier. And beer and sugar and these PPF curves, they're just metaphors for how the world works. Obviously, the world is far more complex with this. But when we start with a very simple scenario and show that 2 countries can gain in trade, that is a very powerful result. One you don't hear very much, and this is one of the main reasons virtually all economists are in favor of free trade between nations. Absolutely free international trade, no tariffs, nor quotas, no export subsidies. Now you may wonder, how generalizable is this result? Is this a general result, or is this a result that just happens to flow from PPF curves that looks like this? It turns out that you always get this result that both countries can gain from trade when the 2 PPF curves have a different slope. For the U.S., the slope was -1. For Cuba, the slope was -1/2. And so long as those slopes differ, both countries can gain from trade. If it turns out the slopes are exactly equal, then the 2 countries can be neither harmed nor benefit from trade. There's just no point in trade then. And finally, it should be said that there is obviously a lot of debate about trade. The vast majority of the debates about trade are not about this comparative advantage in PPF model. Meaning the result I just showed you, as far as that model goes, there is no debate. Most of the people who are anti-international trade, anti-globalization, they're against trade because they don't view trade as in this model. They view trade as giving multinational corporations the power to go into small countries, to bully them, to oppress them. And so they see trade, they would be in favor of trade as long as multinational corporations were highly, highly regulated or prevented from trade. So this is one result. Trade is a hugely complex topic, but this result is still powerful and it deserves a place in debates about trade.